Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. For its first production of the autumn 2018 season, Home in Manchester has once again teamed up with Lyric Hammersmith for an unusual pairing of two of Shakespeare's plays, Othello and Macbeth, assembled into one production by director Jude Christian to highlight in particular the stories of the female characters in both plays. A week before the production's Manchester opening, I spoke to Jude at home to find out how Othello and Macbeth, written as one word, all in lowercase, came about.
Othello and Macbeth has got a slightly weird genesis. Well, actually, it's not weird at all. Basically, I was in conversation with Lyric Hammersmith and with Home here in Manchester about doing a double bill of Shakespearean tragedy, which I thought was interesting, just sort of really pile it on there. And I think that they had maybe originally envisaged it as being two separate productions, which might, we'd sort of condense them, they'd sit either side of an interval, and there might be a bit of a opportunity to discover parallels or common threads between the stories. Yeah. And the more I started to think about what those common threads were, I found the relationship between the two plays quite interesting, because there is an interpretation of it where Othello is a play about a man who has societal pressures put on him, who has his own individual personality traits and his own individual habits, and who finds himself committing a horrific act of violence. And it all happens in a domestic setting, and it feels like quite a sort of closed-ended story. Yeah. And then Macbeth is the story of a man who is also acting in response to societal pressures and is being manipulated by people, and also ends up committing acts of violence.
Yeah, and also in a domestic setting.
Also initially in a domestic setting, which then sort of rolls into this kind of national epic tragedy. And I found that jump in scale an interesting starting point. The story of Othello is happening in a real world, yet people are constantly accusing each other of witchcraft. The play begins with Brabantio accusing Othello of having used dark magic to steal Desdemona away. And Desdemona talks about this handkerchief that he's giving to Desdemona as having sort of supernatural powers. And at the same time, there are a lot of accusations in Othello of women being whores and women being strumpets and women being manipulative, evil, witchy sirens. Yes. Whereas actually what you've got is Iago pulling machinations in the background and Othello responding to them. And obviously in Macbeth you have actual witchcraft, and you have the presence of these supernatural beings, incidentally women, who are influencing men. And at the same time, looking at all of this, there were certain things that were making me angry. There's the general weariness of coming to any classic play, but actually it's still just a lot of plays, and going, wow, loads of men talking, loads of men having jobs, loads of men doing things, and loads of women who are literally named in the script as wife of, and who function to be transacted between men, to be claimed by men, to be murdered by men, or to be blamed for messing up men. And I felt that really strongly looking at the two plays. There felt a massive sense of injustice in looking at the story of Othello and going, I think the word tragedy here applies to the young woman who is murdered by her husband, and yet we constantly say tragic hero in a description of a man who murders one or many people. And I had a bit of a pivotal moment where I watched a 9-hour documentary about O.J. Simpson, as you do, and it was really struck by the extent to which it is the story of Othello. You have a black man in a society which will stereotype and to degrade him, who has done a lot in order to prove himself and to build his position and to be recognised for his prowess, in Othello's case in military terms, and in O.J. Simpson's case as a sportsman. And he marries a woman who they have a really tempestuous relationship. He's incredibly suspicious of her and jealous of her, and then brutally murders her. And the O.J. Simpson documentary did this incredible dissection of the racial politics of America and the backdrop of that story and that case, and the peculiarities around him growing up and the decisions that he was having to make as a black man in a racist society. And what I felt it didn't at all dissect was the gender politics of it. So there's this amazing moment where they show the trial result, and obviously O.J. Simpson declared not guilty, and they said, and then here's a load of documentary footage of white people out protesting in the streets. And I was like, but also a lot of that footage is showing women. And what you're not talking about at all is that there is also a huge legacy in America, alongside a horrific legacy of particularly black people being murdered by, for example, white police officers. It's a really prevalent question at the moment, problem at the moment. Yes. What America also has a huge problem with, as many other societies do, is patriarchal oppression of women, but also there's a particular thing that happens there, which we hear about in the news quite a lot, about sports stars, for example, about there was a case a couple of years ago about a young woman who was sexually assaulted while blackout drunk at a party by a young student who was like a sort of scholarship sports star. And she wrote this amazing statement in court to him, which opened with the lines, "You don't know me, but you've been inside me, and that's why we're here," in which she described what it was like to read in the newspaper the accounts of how he'd sexually assaulted her, and then at the bottom to see his swimming times listed as one of his achievements, and how the community was in shock at the tragedy of this young man's downfall or unfair imprisonment. I think his dad also infamously protested during the court case that it was unfair that he should have his bright future ruined for 15 minutes of action, which was a sort of amazingly inappropriate way to talk about sexual assault. And so all of this thinking was floating in my head, and initially I thought, in quite a heavy-handed way, I went, wouldn't it be interesting to just cut all of the scenes in Othello that don't have women in them? So let's tell the story of Othello, but let's just tell it from the perspective of Desdemona, because when you strip away the amount of stage time that is either Iago saying to the audience, I'm just deliciously evil, aren't my monologues fun, or manipulating Othello, or Othello making long speeches about how painful it is that Desdemona's cheated on him, when you remove all of that information, you get only what Desdemona encounters, which is Othello is acting increasingly unhinged towards her, and she has no idea why, and she has no capacity to connect with him. And their marriage has gone from being a passionate love affair that she was disowned by her own father for pursuing to her assaulting her in front of a large group of people in public, and then very soon after murdering her.
So it becomes a very different story with the same result.
Yeah.
With the audience perhaps bring in their own knowledge of what's in Othello to it.
Exactly, and I think it's interesting to... I think, for example, we've definitely found in the process of cutting it, you go, there are moments that you mourn. There are incredibly beautiful, eloquent bits of language that we're cutting. There are incredibly exciting, dramatic moments of manipulation that we're losing. And it really makes you go, it's troubling, I think, that those were some of the sexiest bits of the play. And again, this is something that you see a lot in culture, and I don't have a problem in a broad sense with the fact that human beings are interested by darkness. I don't think that every play needs to be a morality play in which everyone is really respectful to each other and we all just sit around making sure that we're saying the right things to each other and like constantly empowering one another to feel good about the world. I think that, of course, it's interesting to explore and maybe even celebrate the darkness that humans have, definitely to explore the mess of relationships and interactions, and the ways in which, for example, the men in Othello react because they feel deeply wounded or they feel overlooked by society, and this is their way of viciously striking back. I understand why we want to depict that, but you start to feel the weight of going, it's always those stories, it's always perpetrator, not victim, who we're interested in. And then it starts to feel like you're assigning so little value to the lives of the people who are lost in that. They just become collateral damage in the advancement of humanity.
There is that fascination with the perpetrator generally, though, not just in fiction. Like in true crime, you want to know what made them think that way. Why? I think there's probably an interest in people. Why am I not like that? What's gone wrong with them that they're doing that, or am I capable of doing that? And
I really understand that curiosity, and I think I also understand wanting to find sympathy with the people who do those things. I think that again, I'm not interested in there being a genre of writing where if you write about crime, the aim is to vilify and silence and dehumanise the person who committed it. But I think, again, there's a cumulative effect there, and particularly when you're looking at something like Shakespeare that has so much of a legacy attached to it, I don't think, Shakespeare didn't put those plays forward and didn't, go on podcasts and whatever and publicise this as the story of a tragic hero. But that is the word that we use in association with them. And I think when you look at Othello, what I was interested in terms of putting the two plays together was I looked at Othello and thought, okay, if I strip away just the airtime that is given to those men, so they can still do the things that they're doing, it's just that who we're watching is the woman who ends up losing her life because of it. In fact, the two women who end up losing their lives because of it, and not the two men who are doing it. That gives us a potentially interesting turning point, because there are 3 female characters in Othello. There are slightly more in this version because I've created another one. But Desdemona and Emilia are obviously murdered by their husbands, and then you have Bianca, the girlfriend of Cassio, who everyone just refers to as a whore and kind of spits on and dismisses. And then I thought, okay, you start Macbeth with 3 women who appear to be going on a bit of a a mission to mess with the minds of men. So what would happen if those three women became those three women? And I didn't necessarily... This wasn't about me going, I'm going to prove a political point here. Yeah. There was part of me that just went, whimsically, that seems interesting. But it felt appropriate to give them the mission of seeking justice, somehow righting some wrongs, maybe avenging themselves on the specific men who had wronged them by reincarnating them as characters into Macbeth. So that was a line that I started pursuing, and what I found interesting was when you start working that notion through, it felt really powerful, this idea that these three women who have been so victimised rise up and become powerful witches. It also felt potent that when accusations like witchcraft are thrown around in Othello to, you know, for Brabantio to try and get Othello arrested and to say he's a foreigner, he's got dark magic, for that association, and for words like whore and strumpet that have been thrown at these women, it felt interesting for them to go, okay, I am now the darkness, I am all of the worst things that you've ever put on me, and I'm going to mess you up with that power. If you've said that I am communing with Satan, then bring it on.
Yes.
let's fight God with Satan and see what happens. Which again, it feels interesting in relation to the historical context of Macbeth. Macbeth was being written while witch trials were happening around the country. Yeah. And the more I've thought about that, the more it started to really disturb me, because you think about an equivalent today and you go, okay, that's like one of the most celebrated makers of cultural output in this country releasing an incredibly famous and prolific play in which he takes a group of people who are being persecuted and massacred across the country and casts them in the play as the actual embodiment of the thing they're being accused of. Yes. And we all celebrate that play. You know, it feels like, I guess there's an equivalent of someone writing a play in which they go, here are some deliciously evil Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, watch them mess with society because they're the most evil ones and they're messing with the minds of poor, initially pure people like Macbeth. Yeah. I find the politics of that decision troubling. And everyone always talks about Lady Macbeth and again sort of goes, she's so sinister, just communing with the darkness, and you're like, okay, so basically what the play is saying is women are manipulative, Satan worshipping demons, and therefore what's going on in the country at the time and across Europe of neighbours accusing women of witchcraft for the crimes of being intelligent, being economically independent, talking too much, being gay, not wanting to have sex with their husbands, looking at a man funny just before his horse fell in a ditch. It feels strange to be, for Shakespeare to be working in line with that horrific human rights abuse that's taking place across the country at the time, for him to be a part of that. But I thought that the idea of these women essentially barreling their way into Macbeth and taking it as a revenge tragedy felt like an interesting turning point. But I knew that I didn't want that to be the point of the play. I didn't want this to be about me going, the answer is kill all the men. Yeah. But I think it's interesting to interrogate that, because that is something that people are coming up against at the moment. People are going, how do we fight the injustice that feels like it's everywhere? How do we fight what feels like an endless danger of one group of people towards another? And there are times when the sheer numbers of it and the sheer enormity of it feel horrific. I think that as a society we're at a much better point today than we have been for centuries and centuries, about the majority of people recognising that equality is what we want, and recognising that men and women have been historically raised in different ways, but that men and women are varied as humans and that we all want to live in different ways, and that societal structures that demand that men are really strong and powerful and angry all the time and never cry and have to be the ones who repel society is as damaging for men as it is for women. Yes. I think that we're living at a really hopeful point in humanity, but we're also living at a point where a lot of those arguments are coming out in a really, really toxic way, and where a lot of people are going, there is no meeting ground on this, we must all kill each other. And so going into Macbeth with that sort of that notion, to extent Macbeth is a bit of a cautionary tale about going, give someone an inch and they'll take a mile, or it's about going, one murder isn't going to solve everything. That's what they discover so quickly. They just get stuck and it goes on and on and on. Yeah.
It sort of highlights the dilemma about the witches in Macbeth of, are the witches predicting what happens or are they bringing it about? So I'm sure that was part of your thought process, was it? Yeah.
Well, in some ways they do, I think, a similar thing to Iago, in that they plant things as a trick or a test, and then they watch humans fall for it. Yeah. And Iago obviously hits a different point, because there comes a point when he just tells outright lies to Othello. But I feel like Iago's argument would still be, I didn't do it myself. Like, I didn't actually murder Desdemona, and therefore am I culpable, because all I did was say things that I suspected. So like, I didn't make him do it. And I think there's a similar, you can take a similar approach with the witches, I think.
How do they... Is it still two separate plays? So it's one play, then the other? Yeah,
it's first half Othello, second half Macbeth. I feel like if you came and watched Othello and left at the interval, which hopefully no one will do, that story would still make sense in itself, but it kind of ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. I feel like Macbeth is still the story of Macbeth. It's still the journeys that those characters go on are still there, but there's another story moving underneath it. I think you feel the legacy of Othello sitting underneath Macbeth in a plot sense and a thematic sense.
So what's it been like for you and the actors to explore, because the actors are playing characters in both, aren't they? So explore, naturally, I would imagine, you're feeling parallels between the two just by playing the two characters. So what's that experience been like?
It's been really fascinating, because again, there's that really happy mixture between things that felt like a really deliberate idea to see through, and things where you go, I kind of didn't expect that, but that's quite interesting. I very lazily, when I was sort of writing character breakdowns, particularly for the men who double across the plays, I would say something like, Othello is this and this and this, Banquo is Othello but on a different day and in a different life, and sort of wanted to leave it open. I was like, they're not the same person, but I wonder if there are common traits between them. And sometimes we've really thought about that, and sometimes we've just sort of ignored it and gone, let's just play them as two different people. And the reason that you're reading a link between them is that because the witches are seeing Banquo as the reincarnation of Othello, they have a different relationship to him, the audience have a different relationship to him. I think seeing Banquo die feels different when Banquo has been Othello for the last hour and a half. So the overall process has been a bit of a brain melt, sometimes really exciting. I made the decision quite early on only to use text from the plays, not to write extra things and put them in. But I also didn't want to make it a kind of beard stroking, academically fun, like smug game of going, can you guess where this line came from, and now it means something completely different, because that just doesn't feel like an exciting way to spend your life watching theatre. But it's been useful, I think, having a relationship with the full texts, being able to go, actually it feels like we're just missing a plot beat here and we need to go back in and get that, or going, this conversation which now isn't happening because we're not using that scene, it feels like it's absolutely nailing what these characters want to say at this point, so let's just give them those lines. There was also quite I think in the first version of the script that I wrote and the version that we started rehearsals with, I'd played around with different moments of text or different sentiments going to different characters, which it feels nice because it feels like it links them to each other in a slightly cosmic way. But also, again, it's allowed us to explore moments for the characters that don't exist in the plays that we kind of wish did. There is an element of, write the Shakespeare you want to see in the world, so there's been a little bit of purloining of lines from certain places to serve different people. But the cast have been amazing. They've got this incredible generosity about that sense of it being ensemble. They've got an incredible capacity for going, okay, so somebody else is now speaking words that I used to say, but maybe the words are being heard in my brain, or maybe I'm here. Like, there's been a real playfulness in the room about how to make it work. So it's bizarre because it feels a bit like a devising process, but with two of the most famous plays of all time at our fingertips.
So that's quite a bit of pressure on the actors. They're not just learning lines and staging, they're also partly devising as well in the limited time you've got in rehearsal. So it's a lot, particularly with Shakespeare as well, which is quite demanding to rehearse anyway.
Yes, exactly. I think we're all quite tired. But I think initially I wanted to present a script that felt relatively robust. There were elements in it that I'd sort of gone, I don't entirely know how this will work because I feel like we'll find it when we get it on its feet, or I don't entirely know where this character goes. I want us to figure that out organically. But by and large, when we started rehearsals, I said, I think it's useful for us at the beginning to take everything in this version as being it, and only look to put things in where we feel like we really need them and want them. Because it felt like, with 5 weeks of rehearsal, starting on day one and going, it's a total free-for-all, particularly when you're going, it's not, I worked from the Arden editions of both plays because I find them useful and relatable.
Lots of notes.
Yeah, lots of notes. Sometimes the notes are illuminating, and sometimes you're like, oh, okay, you've really sidestepped having to actually define what someone's saying there. Thanks, Arden. But it was also just, again, that thing for clarity, just going, you've got to have a starting point. And if we'd sat down and gone, let's get all 7 folios and 3 quartos for both plays, and then everyone else's ever edit that's ever happened. But what's nice about this sort of cutting and pasting has meant that people have been going off and doing their own individual bits of research, and people have been going, oh, okay, I don't quite understand that character, but then I read 3 different versions of that scene, and I've realised that in this version they say this, and that feels like it's much more helpful. And that's felt like a really useful way to work.
Yeah. If you had National Theatre rehearsal time and funding, you could probably explore all that, couldn't you? But...
Yeah, but it was quite... I mean, you never get enough time in rehearsals, do you? But I think if we'd had 8 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever, we probably would have more ambitiously sat down to try and build it ourselves, and I think we probably all would have wanted to jump off a cliff by the end of week 3.
So have you found it working with Home?
I love it. I've wanted to work here for a really long time. I've sort of been stalking this theatre for quite a long time. So I moved to... I was going to say Manchester. I actually moved to Salford a couple of years ago after working in London for quite a long time. For lots of reasons, I wanted to move to Manchester. My family's originally from here. But it was also because the theatre scene here is really brilliant. I really love the Royal Exchange and Home particularly. I think that the Lowry and Contact do really brilliant work. And there's an artistic sensibility at Home that I find really exciting. I think the fact that it's a building which is about art, not just theatre, instantly feels like it opens up lots of possibilities. It feels like it's got such an engaged and eclectic audience that it feels exciting to come and put work in front of them. And I get to live in my house, which is always the dream.
You're not living on the road, which I suppose you're doing most of the time.
Yeah.
So what else are you doing at the moment?
Well, what's quite pleasing is that after this show, which I think currently has a body count of like 15 or more and is just relentlessly hideous, I'm going to do a pantomime at Christmas, which hopefully will involve no blood, no corpses, either real or fake. Quite a lot of politics actually, because it's Dick Whittington,
right?
And it feels interestingly in the realm of looking at Shakespeare and thinking, I don't want to just replicate old plays and not question the things that they're saying about the world. I, as an artist, I think that every time you make a piece of theatre, you should look at your source material and say, what does this say to me about the world, and what extent do I want to shape it to make that, tell that story more clearly, or tell that story in a way that an audience will relate to better now. Panto is exactly the same thing. This is the really joyful thing I learned a couple of years ago when I started working at the Lyric Hammersmith on Panto, particularly with a writer called Joel Hallwood, who's got an amazing brain for looking at pantomimes and going, okay, on face value, the story of Jack and the Beanstalk is, if you don't have money, find someone who's big and rich and murder them and get their stuff and then climb down a beanstalk and go home. Similarly with Dick Whittington, Carrie Ad Lloyd and I, who were co-writing it this year, and then I'm going to direct it as well, we looked at the story of Dick Whittington and went, essentially it's boy with no qualifications rocks up from somewhere, arrives in London, has a cat, and then is just made the mayor. And we felt like it would be exciting at this moment in history to, have an election and maybe...
Maybe a blimp.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, always. Maybe a bus with some statistics printed on it. So it has gotten ever so slightly political, but I like to think it's in a soft touch way. It is in a soft touch way because it's mainly like pop songs and glitter. But I also think it's quite unashamedly...
it's got to relate to the modern world and what's going on in the world, hasn't it?
Exactly.
Keep going.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of gender politics in panto, traditionally as well.
Yes, yeah. So, which, again, you have to sort of grapple with.
So do you deal with... do you have a male dame and... do you have women playing male parts? Or?
Well, at the moment we've got... Dick Whittington is male in this version, but obviously we've looked at his relationship with Alice Fitzwarren so that she doesn't just sashay on as a love interest and then leave again. She's got a bit more personality. Dick Whittington's cat is also female, and we have got a male... We've got a man playing a female dame, and then we've got a woman playing several pigeons, some of which are male. So there's
several pigeons.
It's just well, she's playing identical triplet pigeons who were separated at birth.
Right.
Because it's panto.
Yes.
One of them is the current mayor of London. One's a sea captain, and one is a sort of like mermaid pigeon who lives in the land under the sea.
Right.
Spoilers for you.
Yeah. But it seems a big jump from 2 Shakespearean tragedies to panto, but Shakespeare wrote for popular audiences as well, didn't he? He was trying to entertain. What you were saying before, you didn't want to make it an academic exercise.
Exactly.
You're still looking at a popular audience, you're still looking to entertain, I assume.
Yeah, and absolutely the point with Othello and Macbeth, there's a lot of politics behind it, and there's a lot of thinking and sort of academic juggling going on, and trying to be clever about the ways in which they're constructed, but the main reason for doing it is to make something that is hopefully a really exciting and entertaining and moving thing to come and see. One of the reasons that I knew that I wanted to mess with the plays from early on was that I've always loved reading Shakespeare and performing Shakespeare. This is the first time I've ever directed it, but I think I fell in love with it as a kid, and then the older and older I got and the more I became a director and the possibility came along of staging it, the more I got caught in the problem of loving the poetry but the politics making me want to be sick in my hands. And to some extent, this has just been an attempt to stage Shakespeare in a way that I can just love all of it.
Yes.
I hope.
Well, Shakespeare's almost always cut anyway. And you can pretend there's no agenda behind it, but you're always doing it to shape it in the way you want, aren't you?
Well, and from what we understand, it was being cut all the time, even when he was performing it. Stuff, material was going in and out based on whether it was relevant and whether the actors
remembered it because they'd only got the script the day before.
Exactly. So I find the notion that we shouldn't mess with Shakespeare really odd. I find it more strange that we're not constantly asking why we don't mess with other plays.
Yeah.
Because I think that it should all be there for the taking.
Yeah. So what do you want audiences to take from Othello and Macbeth? What do you want them to go away with?
I think that the 2 plays are, particularly when you combine them, there's a real mourning in there for the missed opportunities for love. There's a real space carved out in them for celebrating the moments when human beings got it right and we were really kind and good and gentle to each other.
Yeah.
And I hope that people feel that in amongst the relentless horror and violence of it. And there are moments in the production which I want to be really badass as well. I think that if you're going to stage Shakespearean tragedies, they should be badass.
Yeah.
So, hopefully some of those things.
Othello Macbeth runs at Home Manchester from the 14th to the 29th of September 2018, before transferring to Lyric Hammersmith from the 5th of October to the 3rd of November. For more information, see www.homemcr.org or www.lyric.co.uk. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.